Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. It's always an honor to share with you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, if you have been following the news very closely, you will have noticed that protests in Mexico in general have gone up. And when I say protests, I'm not only talking about students, I'm not talking only about the teachers union, which, as you know, tends to protest quite regularly. We've seen in the last couple of weeks other groups who in the past have participated in different protests as a way of demanding the government for reforms or for changes for resources, especially. But in general, protests have gone up, and this last week we were following very closely the blocking or protests by it was both protest and blocking of highways by the transportation movement or union, also by farmers. If you were in other parts of the country, you probably felt it, especially up in the northern border where people were having even difficulties getting into the United States or crossing the border into the United States or trying to cross in to Mexico. But there was also they blocked the highways of very important highways here in central Mexico. So I guess the question here is what's going on? And of course, we have how could I forget the 15th of November protests where there was a group of young people. We don't know if it was Generation Z or not, but there was clearly a lot of people protesting from all ages, and they had different demands. So I guess the question mark is, what is going on right now, especially right now. That's why I really appreciate today's guest joining us again. You know him well if you've been following this show throughout the years. Ricardo Pascoe, he's Mexico's former ambassador to Cuba, but he's a very, very important security analyst, political analyst here in Mexico. Ricardo, it's always great to have you on the show. Welcome to Living in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria.
I mean, I've written a couple of op-ed pieces just kind of highlighting these different protests that are taking place and somewhat criticizing the government's reactions to these protests. But my sense is that as we're heading towards the World Cup in 2026, it's just natural to expect that these protests dramatically increase because they know it's a time where it's much. I don't want to use the word easier, but it's more likely that you will be able to get some concessions from the Mexican government. I guess the question for you is, I mean, how serious are these protests? Do you think these protests, I guess it depends on the group, do these protests could become a sign of instability in Mexico? What's your take? Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. First of all, just as a sort of a reminiscence of the past, remember that the student movement of 1968
Mm.
uh, happened or occurred in the context of the Olympics that were to be
Hmm.
held here in Mexico. Um, Actually, the big repression on the 2nd of October of 68 was just a couple of weeks before the beginning of the Olympics.
Hmm.
And what we had was a government that was completely paranoid about what was going on and accusing international intervention and the international communist movement involved in promoting it, even the Russians, etc. And there was a massacre of different proportions. Nobody knows exactly how many people, but with two people, three people, it was already a massacre. So there were numerous more people killed. That was 1968. Now we're in 2025, and we have the World Cup in June and July of next year. And suddenly, there's a huge wellspring of social protest and political protest all over the country for all sorts of different reasons. And what you have is social discontent, and it really is a very broad spectrum of social
Mhm.
groups and
Because it's not a coalition, right? I mean, these
not
groups are not coordinated as far as we know.
absolutely not, absolutely not. It's very spontaneous, beginning with the march on the 15th of November, which I was there. I witnessed it, so I had a pretty clear idea of how it was happening, and it was just I would even venture to say that it was completely disorganized. It was huge, yes, but disorganized, which of course immediately belies the fact that it really was not a sort of conspiracy of any sort
Hmm.
could be detected. But the government really said very clearly that it was a conspiracy, an ultra right international conspiracy that was provoking the that movement that day and accusing businessmen from Mexico and from without of promoting that movement and some of the opposition political parties.
Hmm.
And the actual fact of the matter is that what I saw was just a huge upsurge of many different causes. For example, there were a lot of medics and nurses in the march on the 15th of November, protesting the miserable conditions that they work under in hospitals here in Mexico because there is not sufficient equipment for them and they're not being paid. And then you had contingents of people, farmers on tractors protesting because of the way the government has abandoned them or they feel themselves to be abandoned by the government, facing a whole crisis in the international market. And then you have all of the whole movement of the mothers of the disappeared or the wives of the disappeared also marching, protesting that the government does nothing to help them, and in fact does nothing to stop the disappearance from occurring, which seem to be in an upswing rather than a
Hmm.
downswing in Mexico. And on top of that, of course, it was said that this Generation Z was or the group of the social group, students, etc., who had called the march to happen, which in the very beginning is in fact true. It was a group of students who were protesting the assassination of the mayor of Uruapan,
Hmm.
Carlos Manso, which had happened two weeks before the march on the 1st of November. And so what I saw was a very diverse uh, sort of uh, network of or a patchwork rather of just different people out protesting or just very angry with the government because of the problems, the economic problems, and just feeling themselves to be ignored.
Mm. Yeah, well, they also there were teachers. The dissident teachers union was also had been marching or had been protesting, I believe, the day before. I'm not, were they,
Yes,
I'm not too sure they were also marching that day.
no, they marched the 2 days before the 15th. They were on the 13th and 14th. They marched. And then on the 15th was this march. And then what has been happening since then are, you mentioned this already, the huge blockade of highways all over the country
Yeah.
by the transport, the truck drivers, really,
Hmm.
who are facing terrible problems of security in their as they drive their trucks all over the country. And they first of all they started protesting the truck drivers by themselves, and then the
Hmm.
as the farmers by themselves, And then they united in a common front. And then they decided to join together, which is
Mhm.
what really panicked the government when
Mhm.
they joined together, because then it seemed like there was sort of some sort of coalition of demands on the government that, let it be said, the government cannot satisfy because the government is basically broke.
Mhm.
So all of these problems are growing, and none of them have been solved. What the government did was that they broke up violently the march on the 15th of November in the Zocalo with the
Mhm.
police. And they just sort of used a tactic of threatening the drivers and the farmers, threatening to throw them into jail, um, and to indict them for various, what they call a series of causes, but also accusing them of being politically motivated.
Mhm.
So the government, which is very paranoid, is accusing anybody who criticizes the government as as promoting conspiracies against the government, as if the intention were to overthrow the government.
Mhm.
So they're creating this kind of ferment, which, in my experience, means the following. I'll finish with this,
Okay.
um, which is that these protests are going to grow. They're not going to cease.
Mhm.
We're just at the very beginning of what I think is a new cycle of very serious, profound, and prolonged social protest in Mexico.
So, joining us today, Ricardo Pascoe. You're listening and watching Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. I really appreciate all of you joining us because this is a very important conversation because the ability, Ricardo, of the government, the ability of the government to be able to negotiate with these different groups, at least provide or respond sufficiently to their demands so that by the time we get closer to the World Cup, which is in June, July, um, that the closer we get to the World Cup, Mexico is going to need to show to the world that the country is prepared and not only has the ability to be to put on this incredible event, um, in coordination with the United States and Canada, but also that the country has the infrastructure and control, so that this can take place in a peaceful manner. I've been watching very closely their negotiation strategy, and it doesn't look like I don't think President Claudia Sheinbaum has very good negotiators. I mean, you've negotiated, you know how these negotiations go. What's your sense? Who's negotiating, and why did the government of Mexico City suddenly decided that they were going to use cops? And in one of the most violent reactions that we've seen for a protest in Mexico City in a long, long time. I don't remember the police being that violent.
1971 was the last time that there was a repression of this kind in Mexico City.
Mm,
1971, and now we're in 2025, and they're using this government, which is purportedly leftist,
mm,
is using repressive tactics against just pacific protest. I mean, that march, which I insist I attended, was
mhm,
was principally pacific. The problem is that the government, in my opinion, uh, developed a whole strategy to ambush the march.
mm,
They channeled it so that the people could enter the Zocalo in just a very small corner of the Zocalo. And so the march was going entering very slowly, and this gave people that had their faces covered with black masks to start fighting with the police who had nothing to do with the march, absolutely nothing. I mean, in my opinion, they were provocateurs hired and organized by the Mexico City police
Wow.
because they wanted to destroy that movement. And the whole problem is this: the Mexican government, from the presidency on down, which basically controls absolutely everything in this country. They control the presidency, they control the Supreme Court, they control the Congress, they control the military, they control the police. Now they even control the sort of Fiscalia,
The Attorney General's office.
the Attorney General's office, exactly. I mean, they control absolutely everything, and yet they tremble and they're panicking, and any kind of protest, they just absolutely get enveloped in this huge paranoia and respond with repression. And if we saw repression on the 15th of November, mark my words, Ana Maria, that we're going to see more repression because it's a government that is absolutely intolerant
Hmm.
to different opinions, and they cannot deal with people that they think differently than they, and therefore um, they're sort of what they consider is their God-given mandate to
Hmm.
do whatever they want to do with Mexico.
Well, yeah.
Suddenly comes apart at the
I
seams.
mean, I'm seeing from my side is just that in terms of I mean, the protests were to be expected, right? I mean, I think an increase in protest in the country was to be expected because there are numerous demands, and the best time for a government to have to sit down and listen to these movements and these demands is just before a major international event where the international community is watching how the government reacts to these types of movements and these types of protests. And there's a lot of international media in Mexico right now. So I guess it was these marches and these protests were to be expected. I'm just surprised what a bad job they're doing in these negotiations. I mean, I think they're kind of making things worse for them. I mean, they're almost pushing people to go out and continue protest and start using violence. I mean, just the fact that the president decided she's going to have a major meeting at the Zócalo. I think it's the 5th of December, 6th of December, of all her followers, or the 7th, is just a sign of, I think it's not necessary. I'm not even too sure why she decided that was a good idea.
Well, because what they need to show, what they want to show is what they think, which is that they have absolute consensus in the country, except for a few miserable people who are wandering
Mhm.
around creating problems. But their idea that they have absolute consensus, of course, is shown to be false by this
Mhm.
by what's going on, and there is a real upsurge of social discontent. And I would even suggest that there is a great deal of sort of disparaging discontent with the president herself. One of the things that I've listened to in all of the marches, and not only the 15th of November, but amongst medics, amongst university personnel who have also been
Mhm.
protesting, amongst the farmers and the truck drivers, amongst the different groups of women seeking their disappeared loved ones. Of all of those people, they are increasingly disparaging of the president, consider that she just
Mhm.
doesn't know how to deal with these issues and that she's
Mhm.
a very weak figure. So on the one hand, she has a great deal of power without a doubt in
Yeah.
terms in institutionally speaking, but socially there is no correspondence with between her institutional power and her I would what I would say is her power with the people, because
Hmm.
there is this sense of this person who does not listen, who wants to impose her own criteria. And if it has to be crashing down on your head with a baton, she will do it.
Wow. Well, we are heading towards the World Cup, and it just everything seems to indicate that this is probably gonna protests and social movements are probably going to increase, especially with the recent examples of how they're handling. Promise me you'll come back soon, Ricardo, and
I
join
will
us.
let me just remind you, Ana Maria, and your listeners that the teachers union already
Right.
announced that they are going to disrupt
The
the
World Cup.
World Cup.
Yeah.
Whether that comes to that or not is another thing. But I mean, the fact is that obviously the whole problem of the World Cup is increasingly political and not necessarily sporting.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Ricardo Pascoe, political analyst, political and security analyst. He's been joining us throughout the years. I really appreciate you just spending some time with us this weekend. Thank you so much.
Certainly.
Thank you. That was Ricardo Pascoe. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. Don't go away.